The Mallet. There were once two farmer men who were brothers. Both of them worked hard in seed time and in harvest time. They stood knee-deep in water to plant out the young rice, bending their backs 1,000 times an hour. They wielded the sickle when the hot sun shone, when the rain poured down in torrents. Then there they were, still at their digging or such like, huddled up in their rice straw raincoats, for in the sweat of their brow did they earn their bread. The elder of the two brothers was called Cho. For all he labored so hard, he was passing rich. From a boy he had a saving way with him, and he had put away a mint of money. He had a big farm, he did well, with his rice, his silkworms, and his granaries and storehouses. But there was nothing to show for all this, if it will be believed. He was mean, sour, with not so much as a good day and a cup of tea for a wayfarer, or a cake of cold rice for a beggar man. His children whimpered when he came near them, and his wife was much to be pitied. The younger of the two brothers was called Kane. For all he labored so hard, he was as poor as a church mouse. Bad with his luck, his silkworms died, and his rice would not flourish. In spite of this, he was a very merry fellow, a bachelor who loved a song and an honest cup of sake. His roof, his pipe, his meager supper, all these he would share very gladly with the first comer. He had the nimblest tongue for a comical joke, and the kindest heart in the world. But it is a true thing, though it is a pity all the same, that a man cannot live on love and laughter, and presently Kane was in a very bad way. Kane says,
"There's nothing for it but to pocket my pride and go see what my brother Cho will do for me, and I'm greatly mistaken if it'll be much."
So he borrows some clothes from a friend for a visit, and sets off in very neat hakama, looking quite the gentleman and singing a song to keep his heart up. He sees his brother standing outside his house, and the first minute he thinks he's seeing a beggar. Cho is in such ragged gear. But presently he sings out,
"Hey, you're early, Cho."
"You're early, Kane,"
says Cho.
"May I come in and talk a bit?"
"Yes, you can, but you won't find anything to eat at this time of the day, nor yet to drink, so let's make disappointments be avoided."
"Very well, as it happens, it's not food I've come for."
When they were inside the house and sitting on the mats, Cho says,
"That's a fine suit of clothes you've got on you, Kane. You must be doing very well. It's not me that can afford to go out the muddy roads dressed up like a prince. Times are bad, very bad."
In spite of this not being a good beginning, Kane plucks up his courage and laughs, and presently he says,
"Well, look here, brother. These are borrowed clothes. My own will hardly hold together. My rice crop was ruined, and my silkworms are dead. I have not a rin to buy rice seed or new worms. I'm at my wit's end, and I have come begging to you, so now you have it. For the sake of the mother that bore us both, give me a handful of seed and a few silkworms."
At this, Cho made as if he would faint with astonishment and dismay.
Hey, I'm a poor man, a very poor man. Must I rob my wife and my miserable children?"
And thus he bewailed himself and talked for half an hour. But to make a long story longer, Cho says that out of filial piety, and because of the blessed mother of both of them, he must make a shift to give Kane the silkworm eggs and the rice. So he gets a handful of dead eggs and a handful of musty and moldy rice.
"These are no good to man or beast,"
says the old fox to himself, and he laughs. But to his own blood brother he says,
"Here, Kane, it's the best silkworms I got, and I'm giving them to you. And the best rice of all my poor store, and I cannot afford it at all. And may the gods forgive me for robbing my poor wife and my miserable little children."
Kane thanks his brother with all his heart for his great generosity and bows his head to the mats 3 times. Then off he goes with the silkworm eggs and the rice in his sleeve, skipping and jumping with joy, for he thought that his luck had turned at last. But in the muddy parts of the road he was careful to hold up his hakama, for they were borrowed. When he reached home, he gathered great store of green mulberry leaves. This was for the silkworm that were going to be hatched out of the dead eggs. and he sat down and waited for the silkworm to come. And come they did too. And that was very strange because the eggs were dead eggs for sure. This silkworm, well, they were a lively lot. They ate the mulberry leaves in a twinkling and lost no time at all, but began to wind themselves into cocoons that minute. Then Kane was the happy man. He went out and told his good fortune to all the neighbors. This was where he made his mistake. And he found a peddler man who did his rounds in those parts and gave him a message to take to his brother Cho with his compliments and respectful thanks that the silkworms were doing uncommonly well. This was where he made a bigger mistake. It was a pity he could not let well alone. When Cho heard of his brother's luck, he was not pleased. Pretty soon he tied on his straw sandals and was off to Kane's farm. Kane was out when he got there, but Cho did not care for that. He went to have a look at the silkworms. And when he saw how they were beginning to spin themselves into cocoons as neat as you please, he took a sharp knife and cut every one of them in two. Then he went away, the bad man. When Kane came to look after his silkworms, he could not help thinking they looked a bit, dead. He scratched his head, he says,
It almost appears as though each one of them has been cut in half. They seem dead.
Then out he goes and gathers a great lot of mulberry leaves. And all those half silkworms set to and ate up the mulberry leaves, and after that there were just twice as many silkworms spinning away as there were before. And that was very strange because the silkworms were dead for sure. When Cho heard of this, he goes and chops his own silkworms in two with a sharp knife, but he gained nothing by that, for the silkworms never moved again. But they stayed as dead can be, and his wife had to throw them away the next morning. After this, Kane sowed the rice seed that he had from his brother. And when the young rice came up as green as you please, he planted it out with care, and it flourished wonderfully, and soon the rice was formed in the ear. One day an immense flight of swallows came and settled on Kane's rice field. Kane shouted. He clapped his hands and beat about with a bamboo stick so the swallows flew away. And in 2 minutes they came back. Kane shouted and he clapped his hands and beat about with his bamboo stick so the swallows flew away. And in 2 minutes they came back again. Kane shouted, clapped his hands, and beat about his bamboo stick so the swallows flew away. In 2 minutes, back they came. When he had scared them away for the 9th time, Kane takes his tenagi and wipes his face.
This grows into a habit.
But in 2 minutes, back the swallows came for the 10th time. Kane shouted and he chased them over the hill and dale and hedge and ditch and rice field and mulberry field till at last they flew away from his sight and he found himself in a mossy dell shaded by spreading pine trees. Being very tired with running, he lies down his full length upon the moss and presently falls asleep and snoring. The next thing was that he dreamed. He thought he saw a troop of children come to the mossy glade, for in his dream he had remembered very well where he was. The children fluttered here and there among the pine tree trunks. They were as pretty as flowers or butterflies, one and all of them, dancing bare feet. Their hair hung down, and their skins were growing like plum blossoms.
For good or for evil,
says Kane to himself,
I have seen the fairies' children.
The children made an end of their dancing and sat them down upon the ground in a ring.
Leader, leader, fetch us a mallet.
Then there rose up a beautiful boy about 14 or 15 years old, the eldest and the tallest there. He lifted a mossy stone quite close to Kane's head. Underneath was a plain little mallet of white wood. The boy took it up and went and stood within the circle of the children. He laughed.
Now what will you have?
A battledore.
The boy shakes the mallet, and sure enough, there they are, a battledore.
Now what else?
a lot of sweets.
Greedy, says the boy, but he shakes the mallet and there are the sweets. Now what else?
A red crepe frock and a brocade obie.
Miss Vanity, says the boy, but he shakes all gravely out of the mallet. Books, storybooks. That's better, says the boy, and out comes the books by the dozen and score all open to show the lively pictures. Now when the children had their heart's desires, the leader put away all the mallet beneath its mossy stone, and after they had played for some time they became tired. Their bright attires melted away into the gloom of the wood, and their pretty voices grew distant, and then were heard no more. It was very still. Kane awoke, good man, and found the sunset and darkness beginning to fall. There was the mossy stone right underneath his hand. He lifted it, and there was the mallet.
No,
Said Kane, taking it up.
begging the pardon of the fairies, children, I'll make bold to borrow the mallet.
So he took it home in his sleeve and spent the pleasant evening shaking gold pieces out of it, and sake, and new clothes, and farmer's tools, and musical instruments, and who knows what all. It is not hard to believe that pretty soon he became the richest and jolliest farmer in all the countryside. Sleek and fat he grew, and his heart was bigger and kinder than ever. But what like was Cho's heart when he got wind of all this? Aye, there's the question. Cho turned green with envy, and as green as grass.
I'll have a fairy mallet too,
He says,
and be rich for nothing. Why should that idiot spendthrift have all the good fortune?
so he goes and begs rice from his brother, which his brother gives him very willingly in a good sackful. And he waits for it to ripen, quite wild with impatience. It ripens sure enough, and sure enough a flight of swallows comes and settles upon the good grain in the ear. Cho started clapping his hands and laughing aloud for joy. The swallows flew away, and Cho was after them. He chased them over hill and dale and hedge and ditch and rice field and mulberry field, till at last they flew away from his sight, and he found himself in a mossy dell, shaded by spreading pine trees. Cho looks about him.
This should be the place.
So he lies down and waits with one eye shut and one eye widely open. Presently, who should trip into the dell but the fairy's children? Very fresh they were as they moved among the pine trees.
Leader, leader, fetch us a mallet,
they cried. Up stepped the leader and lifted away the mossy stone, and beheld there was no mallet there. Now the fairy's children became very angry. They stamped their little feet and cried and rushed wildly to and fro, and were beside themselves altogether because the mallet was gone. See, cried the leader at last, see, this ugly old farmer man, he must have taken our mallet. Let us pull his nose from him. With a shrill scream, the fairy's children set upon Cho. They pinched him and pulled him and buffeted him and set their sharp teeth in his flesh till he yelled in agony. Worst of all, they laid hold of his nose and pulled it. Long it grew, and longer, and longer, and longer. It reached his waist, it reached his feet. Lord, how they laughed, the fairy's children. Then they scampered away like fallen leaves before the wind. Cho sighed, and he groaned, and he cursed, and he swore, but for all that his nose was not an inch shorter. So sad and so sorry, he gathered it up in his two hands and went to Kane's house.
Kane, I'm very sick.
Indeed, so I see. A terrible sickness. And how did you catch it?
And so kind he was that he never laughed at Cho's nose, nor yet he never smiled. But there were tears in his eyes at his brother's misfortune. Then Cho's heart melted, and he told his brother all the tale, and he never kept back how mean he had been about the dead silkworm's eggs, and about the other things that he had been told of. And he asked Kane to forgive him and to help him.
Wait you still a minute,
says Kane. He goes to his chest, and he brings out the mallet. He rubs it ever so gently up and down Cho's long nose, and sure enough it shortened up very quickly. In 2 minutes it was a natural size. Cho danced for joy. Kane looks at him and says,
Hey, sweet brother. If I were you, I'd just go home and try to be different.
When Cho had gone, Kane sat still and thought for a long time. When the moon rose that night, he went out and took the mallet with him. He came to the mossy dell that was shaded with spreading pine trees, and he laid the mallet into its old place under the stone.
I am the last man in the world to be unfriendly to the fairies' children,